This is the Laboratory Interpretation Guide for the Fertility Profile Plus from DestinyWell. There are two parts to the Fertility Plus Laboratory Interpretation Guide. The first section focuses on the results in regard to what they specifically mean in relation to your fertility concerns. The second section, for the areas of cortisol and thyroid hormones, go into them from an overall health vantage. It talks about what these might mean in terms of health and disease and overall well-being outside the context of fertility. If your main interest is fertility and your lab results are normal, feel free to just stop there and use that for what you're focused on. If, however, your lab results are abnormal, then in addition to working with your healthcare practitioner closely to make sure there's anything that needs to be evaluated or treated, that they're in the loop, that you also look into the section that talks about these from an overall health standpoint so you have a better understanding of them. Both these start with an overview of steroid metabolism because healthy and balanced steroid pathways are essential for both fertility and general well-being. I want to go over something complicated but extremely interesting and important about your hormones. It's called the steroidogenic pathways, and it shows how the major sex steroid hormones as well as your cortisol are closely interrelated and factors that lead from one pathway to the other and how these can influence the levels of the active hormones that you have in your system. We'll talk a little bit about the overview, and then to break it down, we'll go into separate diagrams of how cortisol is produced, what happens with the estrogen hormones, and what happens with the androgens like testosterone. It all starts with cholesterol. If you don't have enough cholesterol, you don't have enough precursors to make your hormones. And so people who take extremely strong cholesterol medicines, they're very sick, or they have very low cholesterol, they may not have enough precursor to make all the molecules they need. And subsequently, their cortisol may be low, or their estrogen and testosterone levels may end up low, affecting their overall well-being. So it starts with cholesterol, and that's converted into pregnenolone. Pregnenolone is the first of the sex-related steroid hormones, and it's a precursor hormone as well. Some of that goes to the hormone progesterone, which is much more common in higher doses in women, and that's important for different phases of the menstrual cycle, but it's also important for brain function and healing in both genders. Next, we'll go into how that turns into cortisol, how it turns into the estrogen hormone group, and how it turns into androgen or male-related testosterone group hormones separately in the next section. Cortisol is a key hormone. It's a life and death hormone. When you're stressed, when you're chased by a lion, when things are desperate in your life, then you make more cortisol. You're in a car accident, you have a heart attack, your body needs to mobilize everything for an emergency. That cranks up your cortisol. So cholesterol goes to pregnenolone and progesterone. Both of those lead to intermediate hormones, 17-hydroxypregnenolone and 17-hydroxyprogesterone. From there, they go to deoxycortisol and then to cortisol itself. Every cell in the body needs cortisol. In an emergency, it's great. It raises your blood sugar, it suppresses your immune system so that you use all of your capacity for flight or fight rather than building things. So it breaks down proteins, it breaks down sugar in storage forms, and it mobilizes you for an emergency, which in an emergency is a great thing. But when you don't have an emergency, when you have a situation where your body's interpreting it as an emergency in our modern culture, you don't get along with your boss, your job is stressful, you have financial difficulties, there's relationship issues or stress where you're living, and your body interprets that as an emergency, then you have sustained high levels of cortisol. Those sustained high levels can break down muscle, they can change the lining of the gut and the integrity of the gut membrane so that you have a leaky gut. They change the health and the character of the microbiome. They make areas of your brain like the hippocampus, which is important for short-term memory incorporation, they make those areas shrink. So an emergency on a long-term basis is not a good thing. But when your body perceives it's in trouble, it shunts as much cholesterol and as many precursors as possible into cortisol. Now, cortisol has one other thing that can happen to it. It can get turned into the inactive cortisone form. Cortisone serves as a reservoir, and so people who have insulin resistance, they have VAT or visceral adipose tissue, fat around the middle, people with diabetes, folks like that are more likely to have high levels of cortisone. The cortisone serves as a reservoir, and so when cortisol goes down, it gets converted back from cortisone to keep it high. So people in that situation may have sustained higher levels of cortisol. So that's the pathway from cholesterol to your emergency hormone cortisol, which is important at moderate levels for function on a day-to-day basis and is used as an emergency situation hormone for things that come up. The first part of this pathway we're going to break down is the estrogen hormone part of the pathway. Again, things start with cholesterol, and they end up at 3 different estrogens: estrone, estradiol, and estriol. E2, or estradiol, is the strongest of these, the one that's the principal circulating hormone before menopause and is made in the ovaries by women. There's estrone, which is a weaker hormone, and there's estriol, which is also a weaker hormone that comes from estradiol as a less active metabolite. So it starts with cholesterol and goes to pregnenolone and to progesterone. As we said, progesterone is important in both men and women for function of the nervous system. It's helpful for sleep, and it helps with healing of tissues when they're injured. You can go to 17-hydroxypregnenolone or 17-hydroxyprogesterone. Both of those go to the weak androgens DHEA and androstenedione. DHEA, dihydroepiandrosterone, is an androgenic molecule. It's one of the most common hormones in circulation. It's made by the adrenal glands, and it's a precursor made into a lot of other things. It peaks in around the 20s, and then as you get older, the levels gradually go down. Now, if you just take exogenous or external DHEA, it will improve your sense of well-being. It'll help muscle mass a little bit. There are receptors in the brain that respond to this. And so a lot of times people say, well, take some DHEA, it'll help you feel better. And it might. But the problem with pouring in a precursor molecule like DHEA is you never know where it's going to go. So you pour in a high dose of this. If you're a man, some of it may get metabolized into the estrogens, like estrone and through testosterone to estradiol. And if you're a woman, it may go into the testosterone pathway. So let's say you're a man, you take some DHEA initially, you get a high dose of that in your system, you get more well-being, you may make some more muscle and feel better. But if you metabolize a lot of it into estrogens, you may get some loss of muscle mass, you may get development of breast tissue, you may get changes in emotional situations and how you feel that you weren't expecting. The opposite is true in women, is if you pour in a bunch of DHEA, you probably will get some increased well-being. You might get a little bit of muscle boost, but additionally you can metabolize that into male hormones. And so if you increase your testosterone or some of the other androgens by doing that, you can get acne, you can get deepening of the voice, you can get other changes or even enlargement of the clitoral area. And so there are a lot of different things that can happen by messing with these precursors. So in general, cholesterol through the progesterone pathways go to the intermediates, and then they're converted to the weak estrogen estrone, and then through testosterone to estradiol. That's where most of it happens in the ovaries. It's directly produced as estradiol and released there. After menopause, estradiol comes from aromatization of some of the adrenal precursors, the DHEA and androstenedione, and so there is less of the estradiol and more of the E1 and E2 hormones following menopause. Now let's take a look at the testosterone or androgen side of the pathway. Again, it begins at cholesterol. Cholesterol has the ring structure that can be made into any of the steroid hormones. It always goes through pregnenolone. Pregnenolone is the initial sex steroid-related metabolite, and that can be turned into progesterone, into the estrogen family, or into the testosterone and androgens. So from pregnenolone, it can go to progesterone. Progesterone also has important functions in men in the neurologic tissues and also for healing. Both pregnenolone and progesterone have 17-hydroxy metabolites, so pregnenolone goes to 17-hydroxypregnenolone and progesterone goes to 17-hydroxyprogesterone. Those can be converted respectively into DHEA and into androstenedione. DHEA can go through intermediates into testosterone, and androstenedione can go directly to testosterone. So both of these pathways ultimately lead to testosterone. We've talked about DHEA as well having important roles. Both DHEA and androstenedione have testosterone-like effects, but they're much weaker, although they do circulate in high levels because they're some of the main hormones made by the adrenal gland, especially DHEA. It's a major precursor molecule. When we give DHEA from the outside, We get increased well-being because there are receptors in the brain that it fits into and helps with overall feeling and how you're doing. It also helps with muscle mass. But like we discussed previously, DHEA can go unpredictably into different pathways. It can end up as estrogens in men, and it can end up as testosterone in women. So the main pathway from cholesterol to testosterone is through the progesterone metabolites, through the weak androgens DHEA and androstenedione, to testosterone itself. Now let's look at these pathways put back together again. It all starts with cholesterol. So if your cholesterol level is too low, you may not be able to make enough cortisol or any of the sex steroid hormones. So we've set the norms at DestinyWell for our optimal zone at a range where you'll have enough cholesterol to make all of these hormone molecules. They go through the progesterones, and then it goes to cortisol when you need it. Now you need a bit of cortisol all the time, but if your body's either chronically stressed, you always perceive it's an emergency, or you really do go through serious emergencies like a car accident or a major surgery, then the body diverts massive amounts of cortisol on a sustained basis into the flight or fight mode. So it'll take all those precursors and shunt things down to cortisol. That's called the cortisol steal. You take everything you have, you put it into life or death reactions. That leaves a lot less molecules to get turned into the estrogens and into testosterone. So your sexual function, your sexual development, your ability to reproduce, all of those go down substantially when it's a life and death situation. So the more we can send our signals for life and death just when there are emergencies rather than all the time from chronic stress, the better and healthier our other hormone pathways will be. If you have a lot of inflammation in your system, then in women, that turns on the 1720 lyase pathway and converts progesterone into androgen metabolites and testosterone. That's what happens in things like polycystic ovarian syndrome, where the 1720 lyase is turned on. That's turned on by things like insulin resistance and abnormal glucose metabolism. And then it's also true that in men, when there's insulin resistance and obesity and visceral adipose around the middle, fat tissue around the belly, that the aromatase enzyme is turned on. That converts testosterone into the most active estrogen, E2 estradiol. And so men then get estrogen type effects when they're stressed from turning on the aromatase. So overall, we can see these pathways are very closely interrelated. How our stress is, how our precursors are, how the balance in our life is, as well as our glucose metabolism and our body habitus. All these play together to determine the balance of hormones we have and our overall state of health. FSH, or follicle-stimulating hormone from the pituitary, is trying to drive the ovaries to produce estrogen and ovulate. If it's higher on day 3 of the menstrual cycle, during the follicular phase, that means the ovaries have less reserve. There are less follicles and they have more trouble responding. Lower numbers of viable follicles mean that you will produce less estrogen and there are less follicles to ripen and ovulate. FSH also plays the role of preventing apoptosis. Apoptosis involves death of small follicles. Thus, FSH helps to preserve fertility by preserving the small follicles. Follicles, once they are recruited and grow, produce estrogen hormones. FSH maintains estrogen levels during the first half of the menstrual cycle, and it also helps the ovaries get ready to ovulate. In perimenopausal or menopausal women, when the ovaries fail to respond and the FSH level goes above 30, that's a sign that they may be in or near menopause. A single reading above 30 on FSH does not indicate menopause because the levels can go up and down for a period of time. Several readings in that range over a period of time, especially if coupled with 6 months or more of no periods, means that a woman is in menopause. At DestinyWell, we define laboratory ranges in a sophisticated way. We use the standard ranges, represented by the blue bar here, from each reference lab that does a particular test to define the lab high and the lab low. If you have thyroid test results that are too low based on the lab's formal norm, then you have a diagnosis of lab low thyroid function or hypothyroidism. Similarly, for glucose, if you have a lab high blood sugar of over 126 on 2 occasions, then you meet the formal diagnosis criteria for diabetes. That's needed to make a medical diagnosis. But at DestinyWell, we think that there can be a lot more nuance. We believe that there's often an optimal range based on what we've found going forward helps people to live the healthiest lives, to be the healthiest, and to avoid disease. We triangulate this with the medical literature, with other people's standards, with our clinical practice experience, and all the different data points we can get, so we can come up with what we believe is optimal for a particular test result. DestinyWell also, in the red bars here, will define a DestinyWell high and a DestinyWell low. These may or may not line up exactly with a laboratory high or low, because sometimes we think that the range can be higher or lower, or that it needs to be different. And in between the optimal and the green bar and the low and the high in the red bars, we have orange zones for moderately high and moderately low. They're not quite optimal, but they're not in the high or low zone. Estradiol, also called E2, is the main estrogen hormone in women. It's both the strongest and the one that's most predominant before menopause. It's produced by the ovaries and is responsible for women's shape, for their uterine function, for breast development, and it's also important in fertility and health. It's made by the ovaries and then later in life by the adrenal glands. Estrogen is very important throughout pre-pregnancy and the pregnancy period. It's a crucial hormone needed for the buildup of the uterine lining during the first half of the menstrual cycle so that the uterus is ready to receive the implanted egg. It remains important throughout pregnancy. Progesterone is the other main hormone that regulates a woman's cycles, but also has many other important roles in the body. It's important for neurologic function and also for healing of tissues throughout the body when there are wounds or injuries. The normal level on the low end is 3.3 nanograms per milliliter, and on the high end, 22.5 nanograms per milliliter. It plays many key roles and is important both for cycling and in early pregnancy. It's made by the corpus luteum and is especially important during the second half of the cycle, as well as during early pregnancy to maintain a favorable environment in the uterus for the fertilized egg. Pregnancy problems related to low progesterone in the second half of the cycle leading to fertility difficulties are called luteal phase defects. The first half of the cycle, which is estrogen dominant, is called the follicular phase, And the second half of the cycle, where progesterone is more important, is called the luteal phase. In addition to the levels of estrogen and progesterone, the balance between estrogen and progesterone is also important. Women can get into a situation called estrogen dominance, where their estrogen levels are relatively high in relation to their progesterone levels, which are either low or are low in balance to the estrogen amount that's around. In this situation, women develop increased subcutaneous adipose tissue, so they get fat distribution around the hips, more of a pear-shaped configuration than apple. That's less of a cardiovascular risk, but it does indicate this estrogen dominant situation. Estrogen can be converted from other precursors in fat tissue by aromatase enzymes into higher levels. And so people who have higher levels of fat and insulin resistant are more likely to be estrogen dominant. It's also possible that environmental xenoestrogens can contribute. A xenoestrogen is a chemical, like some plastics and other types of molecules that are used in industry, that has estrogen-like properties. You've probably heard of streams where all the frogs are female. Well, a lot of times that's from so much dominance of these estrogen-type chemicals in our water and in our ecosystem. If a woman gets a lot of exposure to xenoestrogens, her body may sense more overall estrogen, combining her own estrogen plus these from plastics and other chemical compounds in relation to the amount of progesterone in her system. One thing to do about that is to eat a cleaner diet with organic foods and also to avoid products and plastics and chemicals as much as possible that have this xenoestrogen component. Testosterone levels in women are substantially lower than they are in men, but it still plays an important role in overall health and in fertility. The normal ranges are 20 nanograms per milliliter on the low end to 130 nanograms per milliliter on the high end. Overall, it's likely to be better to be in the top half of this range than the bottom, because there is increased vigor, increased muscle mass, and higher libido, which could lead to higher rates of intercourse and successful conception. On the other hand, if a woman has PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, then higher levels can be problematic. Overandrogenization, or too much testosterone-like effect, can lead to lowered voice, which can be permanent, can lead to clitoral enlargement, it can lead to acne, and it can lead to hair growth in unwanted places. Testosterone does play a role in fertility. Women with disorders such as PCOS that have elevated levels of testosterone and other androgens have higher miscarriage rates. However, elevated testosterone levels alone do not correlate with pregnancy rates or outcomes. Lowered testosterone levels in women who have diminished ovarian reserve do go along with lower rates of implantation of the fertilized egg. Testosterone improves egg quality, and so an egg of higher quality that gets fertilized is more likely to go on to be a successful pregnancy. SHBG, or sex hormone binding globulin, is synthesized in the liver. SHBG binds tightly to estrogen, dihydrotestosterone, and testosterone and carries these three hormones throughout the blood. The level of SHBG changes with age, with liver disease, with obesity, and also with elevated thyroid function, hyperthyroidism. Higher SHBG levels mean more of the hormone is tightly bound to this protein in circulation and not available to have effects on the tissues. Lower SHBG levels mean the opposite, more free hormone to cause hormone effects on tissue like muscle and the sexual organs. DHEA and DHEAS, dihydroepiandrosterone and dihydroepiandrosterone sulfate, are important hormones in women. They are precursors, and they have to do with overall vigor and well-being. The normal range is between 40 micrograms per deciliter and 290 micrograms per deciliter, but that varies by age. It starts to peak in the 20s and then goes down in the 30s, 40s, and 50s and onward. So the higher end of range for your age group is probably ideal, and the closer you can get to the top half of this, between 165 and 290 micrograms per deciliter, is probably better. 40 to 164 is mildly low, and less than 40 is low. It's produced by the adrenal glands, the ovaries, and the brain. It gets converted into both testosterone and estrogens and functions like a weaker version of testosterone by enhancing muscle building, burning fat, improving mood, and improving libido. DHEA has been linked to fertility and has been used as part of treatment for infertility problems. In addition to boosting estrogen and testosterone levels, it may boost ovarian reserve, the number and quality of remaining eggs. DHEA has enhanced both pregnancy success rates with in vitro fertilization and with spontaneous conceptions. It's been linked to increased quality and number of embryos and decreased miscarriages, as well as lower rates of chromosomal abnormalities. In the setting of fertility issues, it should only be taken as a supplement under the supervision of the physician who is caring for your fertility situation because of the complex hormonal interactions with other medicines and with your own hormones. DHEA and the sulfate form DHEAS that's more readily measured in saliva are important hormones because it's a precursor hormone and it's one of the most common hormones produced by the adrenal gland. Like in men, DHEA tends to peak in the 20s and then go down significantly with age until it's only a fraction of the previous peak levels. DHEA has a male androgenic type component and helps muscle mass, but it can also be converted into testosterone or into estrogen or other hormones. So it's important to be careful with giving DHEA supplements because you don't know exactly what they're going to turn into, and they could elevate levels of testosterone in women and cause things like voice changes, enlargement of the clitoral area, and acne, as well as irregular cycles and other problems. FSH is the main pituitary hormone that regulates estrogen and is also predominant during the first half or follicular part of the menstrual cycle, when the follicle is getting the egg ready to ovulate. When measured on day 3 of the cycle, FSH can give an indication of how much ovarian reserve there is. As the FSH gets higher during this time, it means that the pituitary is having to try to stimulate the ovaries harder, that there are less functional ovarian follicles, and over time, less chance of pregnancy. Typically, the laboratory reference range during the follicular phase on day 3 is 2.4 units per liter on the low side and greater than 9.3 units per liter on the high side. When it gets to be lab high, the chances of getting pregnant go down, and especially as it gets over 12 or so, even with artificial implantation of a fertilized egg, then the chances are lower, but not zero. At DestinyWell, we've set the optimal range for day 3 follicular FSH measurements at 3 to 8. Values that are moderately low are 2.4 to 2.9 and are definitely low, less than 2.4. We want it to be 3 to 8 because that indicates that there are functioning follicles, but that the brain doesn't have to stimulate them too hard. Mildly elevated is 8.0 to 9.3, and definitely elevated is above 9.3. During the luteal phase, we see a slightly different range for FSH. FSH on the low side of the laboratory normal range is 0.6 units per liter, and on the high side is greater than 8.0. We still set the DestinyWell ideal range at 3 to 8, the moderately low range at 0.6 to 3, and a definitely low range at 0.6, with high being greater than 8.0 during this part of the cycle. FSH has a number of key functions. In addition to regulating estrogen, especially during the follicular or first half of the menstrual cycle, and getting the egg ready to ovulate, it also has other functions. It serves as a marker for how much ovarian reserve there is. If FSH is higher, either during the 3rd day of the cycle in a premenopausal woman when we're thinking about fertility, or when it's higher all the time in a postmenopausal woman, it means that the pituitary is stimulating more FSH in order to try to drive the ovaries. The ovaries have less reserve, and so a higher FSH means that they have trouble responding, that the woman is closer to having infertility problems or closer to or in menopause if it's significantly higher. Lower numbers of viable follicles that can produce eggs mean that the body has higher FSH levels to try to stimulate those follicles to produce. FSH itself also has another key function. It helps prevent apoptosis. That's the death of small follicles. So FSH helps to preserve the follicles until menopause so that there are more of them that could ovulate and have a baby. Follicles once recruited grow and produce estrogen hormones. So estrogen comes from stimulated follicles stimulated by the FSH. This graph shows that the FSH, like LH, peaks just before mid-cycle. The peak is not nearly as dramatic as with the LH, but it is notable. You can see that the FSH does tend to be higher during the early follicular phase and goes down during the second half of the cycle during the luteal phase. We measure LH in premenopausal women during the luteal phase and also LH in premenopausal women during the follicular phase on day 3. During the luteal phase, the laboratory reference range is 0.5 on the low end and 12.8 on the high end. We generally feel that anything in this range of 0.5 to 12.8 is acceptable. During the follicular phase, the low end is less than 1.6 units per liter and the high end is greater than 9.3 units per liter. One thing that can sometimes be useful is to measure the LH to FSH ratio on day 3. If this ratio is greater than 2 or 3 to 1, it indicates an increased chance of a woman having polycystic ovarian syndrome. Cortisol is the body's main stress hormone. The reference lab range for cortisol is 8.5 micrograms per deciliter to 19.8 micrograms per deciliter. Cortisol has a strong diurnal pattern. It tends to peak in the morning, and if it doesn't get up to normal morning levels, we worry that you're cortisol deficient, or you could even have a disease like Addison's disease where your body makes inadequate amounts of cortisol. DestinyWell has set the optimal range at 10 to 15, mildly high at 15 to 19.8, and too high over 19.8, with mildly low at 8.6 to 9.9, and too low at less than 8.5. Chronic stress and elevated levels of cortisol can cause hormonal imbalance and disrupted sleep, mood difficulties, lower testosterone and low levels of libido, decreased sexual function, and other problems. Elevated levels of cortisol have been associated with lower rates of fertility. It makes sense that the body would not want to conceive during times of maximal stress, so the role of cortisol in suppressing fertility when it's in high levels is not surprising. This happens at the level of the brain, where secretions of hormones like LH are suppressed, resulting in absent or lower LH surge to trigger ovulation at mid-cycle. It also occurs at the tissue level, where hormone precursors are shunted to make cortisol for survival, thus lowering estrogen and testosterone levels, which are essential for fertility. A more extended discussion of cortisol and stress and how they're related and cortisol overall can be found in the second half of this laboratory interpretation guide. TSH is a signaling hormone sent from the brain to stimulate the thyroid gland to make more hormone. So when TSH is elevated, it means the brain is signaling that it's not getting enough thyroid hormone, and the thyroid should make more. If the problem is at the level of the thyroid gland, which most thyroid problems are, then it's a signal from the brain to the thyroid gland to make more thyroid hormone. If the TSH is low, on the other hand, it means the brain is signaling the thyroid gland that it's sensing too much thyroid hormone. This happens when the thyroid is overactive in hyperthyroidism. If in the rare circumstance the problem is at the level of the brain, then the meanings of these test results are opposite. For an extended discussion of this, see the second section of this interpretation guide. Hypothyroidism, or low thyroid function, is associated with poor ovulation and irregular periods, both of which can decrease fertility. It's also associated with fatigue, being overweight, and lower overall well-being, all of which can impair libido and imbalance other hormones in the body. Low levels of thyroid hormone can interfere with ovulation, the release of the egg from your ovary. This can impair fertility. Some of the autoimmune conditions that cause many cases of thyroid problems can also impair fertility, as can disorders of the pituitary gland in the brain, which also regulates other hormone systems vital for effective reproduction. Abnormal thyroid function, particularly hypothyroidism, may be associated with an increased rate of miscarriages. Some doctors think that subclinical hypothyroidism could account for a number of cases of unexplained infertility. Subclinical cases are those that don't have any clear-cut symptoms of low thyroid function, but still can have effects on many of the body's systems. While the majority of the impact of thyroid problems on fertility comes from hypothyroidism, since it is more common, hyperthyroidism, too much thyroid, is also associated with fertility problems. TSH is the most commonly measured thyroid hormone. As we discussed, many doctors don't measure anything other than TSH. But for me, that's like looking at a jigsaw puzzle with only one piece. If the puzzle has 5 or 6 or 7 pieces, you get a lot more complete picture of what's actually going on if you put them all together than if you just look at a single piece. TSH has a reference lab range of 0.4 on the low and 4.0 on the high. At DestinyWell, we think the optimal level of TSH is 1.8 to 3.0, with values over 3 representing thyroid function in primary hypothyroidism that is too low. 90 to 95% of the population have a TSH under 3, and so we think it makes sense to be in the range below that. We think a value of under 0.4 is too low, and between 0.5 and 1.7 may also be on the low side. Our free T4 ranges, the lab reference range is 0.93 nanograms per deciliter on the low side to 1.0 nanograms per deciliter on the high side. We think 1 to 1.5, the green zone, is optimal, and we think less than 0.93, the lab normal, low, is too low. We also believe 0.93 to 0.99 is moderately low, 1.6 to 1.7 is moderately high, and again agreeing with the lab reference range, greater than 1.7 is too high. The free T3 is the active hormone. We find it to be critical, and it's what acts inside the cells. Most of the time, free T3 is a good representation of what your thyroid is doing. Occasionally, T3 will be elevated in hyperthyroidism without elevation of T4, so I always check both. Rarely, T3 won't be able to get into the cells, and you'll have what's called T3 pooling. So it looks like there's a lot of T3, but it's actually not making it into the cells where it can affect its action. For T3, the lab reference range is 2.1 picograms per milliliter to 4.3 picograms per milliliter. We feel that the optimal zone is 3.4 to 4.3, with being higher than 4.3 is too high and lower than 2.1 is too low, with 2.1 to 3.3 in a mildly low range. The most commonly used marker of autoimmune thyroid function is called TPO, thyroid peroxidase antibodies, or sometimes it's also called microsomal antibodies. Obviously, the desirable amount of thyroid attacking antibodies to TPO is 0. You don't want your body attacking your thyroid gland at all. We say that the level of 1 to 34 is mildly elevated, and greater than 34 units per milliliter is elevated or abnormal TPO antibodies. In this next larger section, we'll go over cortisol, cortisol rhythms, and thyroid hormones in relation to your overall health, how they work, and what imbalances may mean for you. Since cortisol is so critical for life on a day-to-day basis, it tends not to go down as we age, but it does have a strong day cycle rhythm. Over the course of 24 hours, if you're on a normal sleep cycle, sleeping at night, waking up in the morning, it bottoms out around 3 a.m. and then rapidly peaks somewhere just around or before 8 a.m. Then it goes down as the day goes on to be lower in the afternoon, getting you ready for sleep, and higher in the morning, activating things and raising your blood sugar, getting you ready for the day. So symptoms of too much cortisol when you get Cushing's disease are red, round, flushed face, elevated blood pressure, thinning of the bones and osteoporosis, elevated blood sugars or diabetes, purple stretch marks or stria on the skin, look the same that many women get with pregnancy, mood swings and anxiety, rapid weight gain in the face, chest, abdomen, and with thin arms and legs, and often with a buildup of fat in the upper central shoulders. These people will often have increased thirst and frequent urination. Symptoms of too little cortisol, Addison's disease, include fatigue, dizziness, especially dizziness on standing, a lot of nausea, weight loss, muscle weakness, mood changes, and then darkening of the skin. They may get an actual bronze type color that's even different than you get with an intense suntan. There's a hierarchy of hormones, with adrenal hormones like cortisol ahead of thyroid hormones, ahead of sex steroid hormones like estrogen and progesterone in women and testosterone in men. If someone has a severe adrenal problem like Addison's disease where they don't produce adequate amounts of cortisol, then it may be a life-threatening condition. The salts in their blood like sodium and potassium can be way out of balance, but it also affects the production and function of other hormones, so their thyroid hormone may be low as well. And just addressing the adrenal problem by fixing the cortisol can actually normalize the thyroid without any separate treatment for the thyroid. Similarly, if someone, say a woman, has a thyroid problem and her thyroid function is low, she has hypothyroidism, then her periods may be irregular, she might have problems like infertility, in addition to the typical symptoms of low thyroid. So fixing the thyroid for her might normalize her sex steroids, might normalize her estrogen and her progesterone, get her cycles back to normal, and even fix infertility. We measure at DestinyWell the free hormones, the free T3 and the free T4. There are total amounts of those you can measure in the blood called total T4 and total T3. Those are somewhat less relevant because a lot of it is tightly bound to proteins and they're not available for the cells. The free T4 is critical in the feedback loop in terms of what the brain sees and the signals it sends to the thyroid to make more or less thyroid hormone. And the free T3 is probably the most critical. It's the active form of thyroid hormone that the cells see that tells them to regulate their metabolism and many other important functions. There's also another hormone that's rarely measured called the RT3 or the reverse T3. If you've been to a doctor and you haven't gotten the explanation you need, or all your thyroid tests look normal, but you still have symptoms of hypothyroidism, you're cold, you're sluggish, you're tired, you have a lot of fatigue, many other symptoms like that, then measuring the RT3 can see if this inactive form or blocking form of the T3 hormone is actually interfering with your thyroid function at the cellular level. I've trained many doctors and many medical students over the years, and thyroid hormones are tricky to understand, but there are a lot of things we can do about them on a practical level. Lifestyle things, lifestyle changes, things that can affect the T3 to RT3 ratio, that's how active your hormones are, nutritional things that will affect this metabolism. And so especially if you're not feeling better after the usual interventions or after just normalizing your thyroid hormones, it may be time to check the RT3. Most thyroid hormone released from the thyroid gland is the T4. Some of that gets bound to protein, and then some of it is free circulating around in the system. In the cells, especially the liver, the majority of T4 is converted into T3. If the gut microbiome, the bacteria in the gut, are healthy, about 20% of the thyroid hormone is converted from the T4 to the active T3 there. Then it's reabsorbed back into the circulation and goes to the cells. We also mentioned that adrenal function is critical. The thyroid needs normal adrenal function, normal cortisol levels in order to produce adequate thyroid hormone and for it to work at the cellular level. This is one of my favorite diagrams. It shows the feedback loop and how the brain and the thyroid work together and how they talk to each other. A brain area called the hypothalamus puts out a hormone called TRH, or thyrotropin releasing hormone. That goes down to the anterior pituitary, which is also in the brain. The pituitary gland is where the TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, is made. Thyroid stimulating hormone does exactly what it says. It stimulates the thyroid to make thyroid hormone. Most of what it puts out is T4, but about 7% of its output is active T3 hormone. Then, when the T3, T4 hormone increases, it gets into balance, and things like low body temperature go back up to normal, heart rate, blood pressure, bowel function, many things that were out of balance normalize when the T3 and the T4 concentrations are normal. When the brain sees adequate or increased amounts of T3 and T4, then it stops sending out extra signal of TSH, and the TSH level goes down. So when everything is working normally, that's how the thyroid and the brain talk to each other and how they regulate each other. This is where it gets tricky. Most doctors and most patients assume that all thyroid problems happen at the level of the thyroid gland. When a thyroid problem, either too high or too low, either hyper or hypothyroidism, happens in the level of the thyroid gland, it's called primary hyperthyroidism for too high and primary hypothyroidism for too low. That's the way most doctors look at thyroid tests and interpret them. What that fails to recognize is that sometimes the problem is in the brain, and that's called secondary or tertiary. If it's at the level of the pituitary in the brain, it's secondary, and if it's at the level of the hypothalamus or higher, it's called tertiary. The reason that's important is that they have somewhat opposite and differing effects on what the tests look like, and they may look like hyperthyroidism when it's actually hypo, or hypo when it's actually hyper, if you're just looking at the TSH and you don't check the other hormones. Primary thyroid problems happen at the level of the thyroid gland itself. Primary hypothyroidism is one of the most common conditions we encounter in medical practice. Hypothyroidism usually comes from something called Hashimoto's thyroiditis, after the doctor who discovered that antibodies were attacking the thyroid in an autoimmune fashion and destroying its ability to secrete thyroid hormone. This is the main kind of primary hypothyroidism we see, but nutritional deficiencies and other problems can also cause this. Hyperthyroidism can also be autoimmune, that's called Graves' disease, or you can have a thyroid nodule that doesn't respond to the feedback loops and just keeps putting out more and more thyroid hormone on its own and doesn't recognize or respond to the signals from the pituitary and the hypothalamus. Both of those conditions, primary hyper and primary hypothyroidism, are in the expected direction that we see for thyroid tests because what we're looking for most of the time is we're looking for the responses we would see as if the condition were primary. But in the back of our mind, we always have to keep in mind that it could be secondary or tertiary. If the problem is in the brain, then the problem is whether the pituitary and the hypothalamus signaling the pituitary send the right signal. If it's secondary, that's a pituitary problem, and if it's tertiary, it's the hypothalamus that sends the signals to the pituitary. So for instance, if the brain just puts out too much TSH, say you have an adenoma or a benign tumor of the brain and it sends out too much TSH signal, it just keeps sending that signal because the tumor is secreting that, then the thyroid will respond and produce more thyroid hormone. The same thing is true if there's damage to the pituitary. Sometimes after childbirth, people get a condition where they have a hemorrhage into that area or they have bleeding into the brain that destroys that, or people who've had brain tumors or radiation or damage to the brain, they may lose the ability to secrete TSH. Then they have a secondary tertiary problem in terms of not producing the TSH, and if the signal is not sent to the thyroid, then the thyroid doesn't know to make thyroid hormone. Most of what we're going to talk about and most of what we look for are primary thyroid conditions happening at the level of the thyroid gland. And the vast majority of what we see is hypothyroidism, and the majority of that is Hashimoto's. But there are variations on that, so we want to be aware of all the different things that can happen. So here's why thyroid functions are so tricky for most people. It's not intuitive, but it is true that an elevated TSH means low thyroid function in primary hypothyroidism at the level of the thyroid gland. TSH is the signal from the brain to the thyroid gland to make more thyroid hormones. In the most common condition, the primary hypothyroidism that occurs from Hashimoto's thyroiditis, where the gland is attacked by autoimmune disease, or other conditions at the level of the thyroid gland, where the thyroid is not making adequate hormone, then the brain says, I'm not receiving enough thyroid hormone, I should put out the stimulating hormone, the TSH, to tell the thyroid gland to make more. So while intuitively we think, oh, TSH is the main thyroid test, if it's high, that must mean my thyroid function's high, the opposite is true. It means the signal to make more thyroid hormone is high, and that happens in the setting of hypothyroidism or low thyroid function. So just remember, high TSH means low thyroid function, means hypothyroidism most of the time, because most thyroid problems happen at the level of the thyroid gland, and that's the way the brain responds, and we're measuring the brain response with a TSH. The brain is mostly responsive to free T4, which is somewhat surprising since free T3 is the active hormone throughout the rest of the body. And it's an area that can get us into trouble some because we think, oh, we have an adequate T4, everything else must be good. But that's not necessarily true because there are a number of factors, both nutritional and stress and other hormones that have to be in balance for adequate conversion of T4 into T3 and also to keep T4 from being converted into RT3, the blocking hormone. So normally when the T4 goes up, the TSH goes down, and when the T4 goes down, that's the main hormone put out by the thyroid gland, the brain senses there's not enough T4, puts out TSH to stimulate the thyroid gland to produce more hormones. So the pattern we see in primary hypothyroidism is TSH elevated, free T4 decreased, and free T3 is also decreased. You should know, however, what we just talked about, that sometimes if the problem is at the level of the brain, in the pituitary, or the hypothalamus, then hypothyroidism has an almost opposite pattern. You get a decreased TSH leading to decreased T4 and T3. So instead of the brain responding, telling you to make more by putting out more TSH, it's the brain that has the problem. It doesn't put out enough TSH, and so the thyroid gland doesn't respond. So the T3 and the T4 and the free T3 and the free T4 are all low in that circumstance. This table is a good summary. It shows that in primary hypothyroidism, the thyroid gland fails to produce the hormones, and then the brain responds by upping the TSH signal. So the TSH is up, the brain is saying send more, and the free T4 and the free T3 that we measure are down because the thyroid gland is not able or willing to do that. In secondary hypothyroidism, the brain fails to send the signal to produce thyroid hormone. So the TSH is low, and the thyroid thinks everything is fine, so it has no stimulus to produce the T3 and the T4, so the free T3 and the free T4 are decreased. When we have elevated thyroid function, or hyperthyroidism, if it's primary, happening at the level of the thyroid gland, then the thyroid overproduces hormones on an independent basis. It doesn't wait for the signal from the brain, it just produces elevated amounts of free T4 and free T3. And in that case, the brain responds by decreasing the TSH. It says, we have enough, we don't need to send any more. Secondary hyperthyroidism at the level of the brain is when the brain sends too much TSH signal to produce the hormone. It sends out excessive TSH, it doesn't respond to the feedback when the levels are adequate, it just keeps sending out TSH, and the thyroid keeps producing free T3 and free T4, so all three are up. Hashimoto's and Graves' disease are both autoimmune thyroid disorders. Interestingly, autoimmunity can cause low thyroid function in Hashimoto's, where the thyroid is attacked by the autoimmune process and destroyed, thus losing its ability to make adequate thyroid hormone and leading to low thyroid function or hypothyroidism. In Graves' disease, the thyroid becomes overactive from the autoimmune process and continues to release too much thyroid hormone, leading to overactivity, which even can be life-threatening. Some families have members that have both Hashimoto's and Graves' disease, and some people in their lifetime have both Hashimoto's and Graves'. Fixing the hormones without addressing the underlying cause of autoimmunity is less effective, and many people still do not feel well, because even if you replace the hormones to perfect ranges, you can still feel terrible if you have an ongoing autoimmune attack against your tissues. And autoimmune diseases also tend to run together, so you're at risk of having more than one autoimmune disease. There are many factors that affect both the production, the conversion, and the activity of thyroid hormones. As we mentioned, the main thing that the thyroid secretes is T4. The free T4 hormone circulates in the bloodstream, and some of it is converted to T3, mostly by the liver, but also by the gut. Now, T3 is the active hormone. So in terms of the production, the body needs adequate amounts of iron and iodine. Thyroid molecules are very iodine rich. Each of them has several molecules of iodine attached to it. It needs the amino acid tyrosine. It needs adequate amounts of zinc, selenium, vitamin E, B2, B3, B6, C, and D. If you have too much stress, if you have infection, trauma, or radiation, if you have fluoride or bromine in your system. Those can antagonize the iodine and replace it in the molecules, making them less effective or less active. And then many toxins like pesticides, mercury, cadmium, and lead can all affect the ability of the thyroid to produce hormones, as well as autoimmune diseases. And celiac is very commonly associated with Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. So I recommend that everyone with hypothyroidism get tested for celiac. Now, once the T4 has been produced, it's not all over. The brain mostly sees T4, but many cells in the body need the active T3 hormone to regulate their metabolism and their function. So we need to convert T4 into T3. And it can either be converted into T3, or as we discussed, in situations where there's too much stress or trauma or very serious illness or other kinds of things like a low-calorie diet or overall inflammation, certain toxins, infections, liver or kidney dysfunctions, and some medicines, then T3 is decreased in production and RT3 goes up. And RT3 is not only an inactive form of thyroid hormone, it blocks T3. So the ratio of T3 to RT3 is important. Now, when the thyroid gets into the cell, it's still not complete. So it needed selenium and zinc to be converted. And then once it's in the cell to be active and effective, it needs vitamin A and zinc. And exercise is also important because it produces factors that help the thyroid function be affected in the cells. Thyroid hormone treatment has also been used outside of specifically treatment for thyroid as adjunctive treatment or augmentation for depression therapy. It's combined with antidepressant medicine sometimes to help with symptoms of depression. A number of nutrients are key, both for the production of thyroid hormone and for the conversion of T4 into the active T3 hormone for penetration into the cell, and in regard to the ability to interact with receptors at the cell level. These include selenium, zinc, iodine, vitamin B12, vitamin D, molybdenum, boron, copper, chromium, magnesium, manganese, iron, and vitamin E. Active thyroid hormone and increases in circulating levels of thyroid increase metabolism. The main risks of overtreatment with thyroid medicines over time are osteoporosis and atrial fibrillation. Osteoporosis is thinning of the bones that leads to fracture risk, and atrial fibrillation is an erratic heart rhythm problem that starts in the top part of the heart and is an irregular rhythm that has other risks associated with it, such as stroke. When someone has low thyroid function, replacement helps many different conditions. It lowers triglycerides, it makes the body form LDL cholesterol receptors and helps change LDL particle number. It helps things like muscle aches and weakness, including fibromyalgia. It's also important to optimize vitamin D whenever you have muscle aches or weakness. It can improve mood and it can improve bowel function, among other things. So what happens when you have too little thyroid hormone, when you have hypothyroidism or an underactive thyroid? Well, you get weight gain, and lots of people would love to have something specific to fix, and so we do check it in anybody who has unexplained weight gain. People often feel cold because thyroid is needed for cellular metabolism and thermogenesis. So to make heat in your body, you need metabolism, and for metabolism, every cell needs thyroid hormone. Bowel function typically slows down. People get constipated. They have foggy thinking. Their heart rate may slow. Their body temperature is low. Women will have irregular menstrual periods or even stop having cycles. That's associated with infertility. Thinning hair is common. And then cholesterol and triglycerides go up. People will also have low mood and low motivation. What about symptoms of too much or overactive thyroid, hyperthyroidism? Well, the opposite happens. You get rapid or irregular heart rates, including atrial fibrillation. Patients get unexplained weight loss. They feel hot all the time. They may have shaking or tremor. They have diarrhea or increased bowel movements. They notice increased sweating, insomnia, and anxiety. The tests included in the Women's Fertility Profile Plus, including the estradiol level for estrogen, the SHBG or sex hormone binding globulin level, progesterone level, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, LH, luteinizing hormone, testosterone, DHEAS, dihydroepiandrosterone sulfate, cortisol level, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, free T4 thyroid hormone, free T3 thyroid hormone, and anti-TPO thyroid antibodies. At DestinyWell, we've been extremely fortunate to find some amazingly good coaches, people with backgrounds of success in varied fields who bring all sorts of resources and talent and skill to help you. These folks have many years of clinical experience, and they know how to be of assistance at every step of the way, from motivation to connecting you with the right resources to finding things that you need to get you on your journey. To learn more, go to DestinyWell.com/coaching to meet our team and find out how they can be of service to you.